Hello everyone, welcome to Bold Conjectures with Paras Chopra. Today I'm with Connor Leahy, CEO of Conjecture AI, where they're trying to build controllable AI systems that don't cause the doom of humanity. He was ex-head of EluetherAI, a non-profit research lab that gave us wonderful open source models like GPT-J. Connor is known for his views on the massive risk AI systems pose to humanity. In fact, Connor has been on this podcast before. 3 years back, when GPT-3 was super new, we had a conversation about how it is a fire alarm and why we need to act before it's too late. And 3 years is a lot of time in the world of AI. Now we have GPT-4, Anthropic Opus, and the progress just seems to be accelerating. So what does it all mean? Let's take an update from Connor. So welcome again to the podcast, Connor.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me back. It's been a while.
Yeah, so we talked on this podcast 3 years back. How has the world changed in terms of AI risk ever since then?
Well, unfortunately, I must report, definitely not for the better. So, to my great chagrin, it seems that many of my predictions turned out to be not only correct, but too optimistic. I think things went even worse than I expected them to go. I was a bit naive 3 years ago about some of the economic and political realities. I think we're going to talk about some of those a bit later in the podcast as well through a kind of a different lens.
Yeah.
Is that if I could summarize the state of the world right now, it would be no one has a plan. There are no adults in the room. No one knows what they're doing, and we're just accelerating as fast as possible towards doom, straight on, no brakes, no lube. That's how I would describe our current state.
Yeah, I mean, you sound much more worried than you were 3 years back when I didn't sense this kind of worry, but it seems
heading
GPT-3 to doom seems like a very strong statement.
I mean, it's exactly what's happening, right? We have for-profit corporations building smarter and smarter agents with zero oversight, zero input, zero democratic, oversight in any ways. They all admit themselves, even that they do not know how to control their systems. They do not know how they work. They do not know what they're capable of until they build them. There's no plan on the government side. There's no plan on the economic side of how to deal with anything from, even prosaic harms, we have deepfake, massive, disinformation and identity theft and so on. No one has a plan for that works. There is massive job automation looming on the horizon. No one has a plan how we deal with that. There's a usual thing where people are like, you bring up job automation and people are like, oh, don't worry. If we work less, it'll be great because then we can just relax and do art. And I'm like, okay, who pays for that?
Right.
Who grows your food? By default, all the resources will either go to the owners of the AIs or the AIs themselves. They're not going to go to the general population unless you have some kind of, massive government, backed redistribution. And which government is currently working on doing that? I don't see anyone currently working on that. And then on the existential risk side, we're building systems that are, every single year that are massively smarter. 3 years ago at GPT-3, a thing that's could write some cute little kind of incoherent, paragraphs or whatever. Now people get upset that, my Cloud Opus, it didn't quite finish my, deployment of my NCCL, distributed programming bug in one shot. Wow. So embarrassing. Yeah. It's like, let's be frank here. It's a joke. Just this morning, I think there's also an announcement of this new robotic startup using AI models, humanoid robotics and so on. At this point, I'm just kind of I stopped making even fun of it. There's a fable, I think it was Aesop's fable of the frog and the scorpion. And the way the story goes is a frog wants to cross the river. And there's a scorpion who also wants to cross the river. And the scorpion asks the frog if the frog could bring him across the river. And the frog says, no, you're a scorpion. You're going to sting me. And then the scorpion says, no, that doesn't make any sense. If I stung you, well, then we would both, drown. So I'm not going to do that. So the frog thinks, okay, yeah, makes sense to me. So frog takes a scorpion. They go halfway across the river and the scorpion stings them. And the frog's like, why would you do this? Now we're both going to drown. And the scorpion said, lol, lamau. I think that's how the story goes.
Yeah, I think it's in the nature of scorpion to do so. And in fact, that whole thing is just so much in parallel to what's happening, wherein people just can't stop themselves from just eliminating them. It's kind of funny, like that the Devin model that came across, and nobody would have guessed 5 to 10 years ago software engineers will be the first to eliminate their job. Why would you
Yep.
do that? It just doesn't make any sense to me. Before we dive into that, Connor, I wanted to ensure we're on the same page for a number of audiences who have not a lot of background. How would you convince them that AI actually poses a grave risk, and what risks would you broadly classify as?
If you build systems that are smarter than all humans, better at politics, business, science, and everything else, and we don't know how to control them, which we don't currently know how to do, what do you think happens? That's it. Like, just think about it. What happens?
Hmm. Um, in that sense, I wanted to go into this question a little later, but since you mentioned it, there are parallels between how people react to climate change and the risk with climate change and this. Do you notice them too? I mean, both are a little bit abstract risks. You can't feel them in your gut. But has there been like discussion around this? Is there similarity
Of
in these two
course,
risks?
there's many similarities. They're both large catastrophic risks that are pushing against a very strong incentive gradient. There's a lot of vested interests that benefit from not addressing climate change. The same way that there's many vested interests who are interested in not addressing AI risk. If it was in everyone's interest to address these risks, they were legible, understandable, cheap to solve, well, then we would solve them. I mean, hopefully. The climate change is a good example of a risk which, through very, very hard fighting after many, many decades, is like kind of now at a position where it has like pretty good global consensus to various degrees. But even then, like, are we on top of climate change? Do you feel like our governments have this under control and we don't have to worry? I mean, not really. So, in a sense, climate change is an easier problem than AI risk. Not that it's an easy problem by any means, but it's a problem which we have global consensus on, goes over decades before the worst harm. There are already harms today, but the worst harms we still have a couple of years or decades. And even then, we're not on the ball. Now take a problem which is 100 times, 1,000 times faster, that unfolds over years, not over decades. That is even harder, relies on even more abstract, weird, technical things that are not quite so understandable. Even so, I kind of disagree that the AI safety problem is that abstract. I think a lot of people present it as this weird, esoteric thing. Well, I think it's actually not that weird and esoteric. It's just like, what do you think happens? You make things that are super smart and that want to make profit and, whatever. What do you think happens if you don't do this properly? Of course, if you have chimps and they create Homo sapiens, and what's the worst that could happen? Like, the worst that could happen is pretty bad. Like, of course.
Yeah. On that, I mean, I notice sometimes people have this baseless optimism, because when we talk about job loss through AI, some people say that that's always happened. People always find a new job. Similarly, with climate change, I know some of my friends have faith in technology that will end up. We've always solved problems. What do you have to say about that? I'm also asking in terms of at two levels: one at a practical level, but also at the level of human nature. Have you thought about it? Where does this come from? This naive faith and optimism that we'll just figure things out, so there's nothing to worry about.
Oh, of course. Like, this is a very common reaction, especially among like tech people and stuff like that. It's always much nicer to just pretend the problem doesn't exist or it's someone else's problem. Like, of course, like, I think this is kind of trivially true. It's a kind of like one of the most obvious coping mechanisms. Just say, don't worry, it'll be okay. Like, it's the obvious psychological defense mechanism. And it's also one of the obvious responsibility deflection mechanisms where you don't want to be responsible for this, right? You want to do your thing. You want to make money. You want to, I don't know, build your family, whatever you want to do, right? And now if someone comes to you and they're like, hey, there's actually this monumentally large problem, then that's kind of also like asking for your time. And then you'll be defensive about this. And I understand. And I think this is a good heuristic. So generally, if you see someone come to you and say, like, here's a monumentally massive thing, you have to dedicate all your resources to it right now, you probably shouldn't listen to them. This is a generally good practice. This person is, unlikely to be very calibrated, unless there's more to it. So if this was the only thing we have, it's just like some guy is saying this is the case, but there's no evidence, there's no consensus, there's no first principles thinking, there's nothing. If there was nothing, then yeah, you shouldn't take this seriously. But like, this is just not the case, like laughably so. Like, look around you, bro. Like a lot of my, so when I look at these like optimistic things, a lot of it I think boils down to the quote, I think it was Upton Sinclair who said, it is very hard to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on him not understanding it. True. So realizing the fact that you work at an oil company and that you don't think climate change is that serious are not independent variables. This is not how humans work. Humans are not perfectly rational beings that evaluate evidence completely disconnected from the social context. If you work at an oil job, there's at least two factors here. The first factor is if you're working there, you don't want to feel like a bad person. Your colleagues, they're all nice people. I'm sure the people who you work with you in your oil company, I'm sure they're wonderful people and you like your colleagues and so on, or maybe you don't, whatever. But like, you're a good person, right? So now this guy telling you that actually maybe you're a bad person because you're doing a bad thing, well, nah, he must be wrong. Yeah. And the second factor is you don't get hired for a job like this if you think climate change is a big problem. If you think climate change is destroying the planet, you don't accept, but also you don't get offered a job as an oil exec. So the fact that oil execs are unusually laissez-faire about this is not an independent variable. This is not like, these things are deeply entangled. I think with tech, it's the same thing. The fact that a bunch of engineers at OpenAI are pretty chill about the AGI risk thing is not a coincidence. It's not like there is a selective pressure towards this kind of thing. So ultimately, you can't just always outsource. Just think about what happens. Like, just sit down for 5 minutes, say we succeeded building these things. We can argue about, will we build these things? When will they be built? Sure, we can argue about all that later. But just assume we succeeded building these things, which a lot of experts think we will in the next couple of years. And a lot of experts agree that we don't know how to control them. Then what happens?
True. So tech is AI researchers, that community is very interesting in the sense that some very smart people deny the risk. So on one hand, we have someone like Jeffrey Hinton, who quit his job in Google to raise alarms about AI. But on the other hand, we have someone like Yakun, who's head of AI at Facebook, who actively denies there is a risk. And both are presumably smart, at top of the game in terms of their research capabilities. So how do you explain this dissonant view and completely polarizing view from the very similar kind of people?
I think this is a very important thing to understand. Smartness isn't everything. Just because someone is smart doesn't mean they're right. Just because someone is smart doesn't mean they're telling the truth. Just because they're smart doesn't mean they're rational. It's actually, there's been some funny studies from back in the day where people with very high IQ actually were less rational because they were better at coming up with rationalizations of things they wanted to believe that were so smart that no one could debunk them. This is a thing I encounter quite often when I'm talking to really smart people, is they will believe whatever bullshit justifies whatever they want to do, and they will justify it using super complex, super brilliant arguments that are really hard to untangle. And so you can use your own intelligence to troll yourself. And this is actually quite common, that people will use their intelligence to troll themselves. Rationality is a skill. It's actually hard to evaluate, and it's not, and it's an important thing to understand about rationality, about making good decisions, about seeing the world for what it is that it's not a purely intellectual skill. So much of what it means to actually evaluate systems objectively is emotional. It's about knowing your own emotions, your own biases, how you relate to these things, how you can control and how you can select for these things. And it's also a deeply social process. Science and rationality are deeply social things. There is no way.
Sorry, I was just asking, can we go deeper into it? I'm very curious about your definition of rationality, especially also how does emotion and social skills come into the play?
So it might be useful for me to introduce the ontology I kind of use when I think about this
Sure.
kind of thing. Is when I think about a mind, I like to kind of split it into four things. This is just my personal way of thinking about it. Not saying this is the one true way. I just find it a useful way to think about
Sure.
intelligence or a mind. I split into four parts. The first part is its world model or its knowledge. So this is what it knows about the world, what questions it could answer, what things it could simulate, what knowledge it has collected, et cetera, et cetera. The second thing is its epistemology. This is how it updates its world model. What procedures does it do? Given a new piece of information, what updates does it apply to the world model? How does it reason about this? The third thing is the decision theory or rationality. Decision theory is given a world state, a piece of information, and certain things you want to accomplish, how do you decide what to do?
Mm-hmm.
And the fourth is your values or your aesthetic. And these are things that are completely disconnected from everything else. They're just what you like. And it can be anything. So in humans, they usually cluster around, fun, happiness, family, friends, etc., or sex, drugs, whatever. But they can theoretically be anything. Some people like classical music, some people like heavy metal. It's what it is. So the values are what you spend resources on, and the other things are about gaining resources to spend on your values, whatever your values are. So rationality is what I'm calling decision theory here, is the more rational they are, the better you are at not making decisions which are predictably stupid. Mm-hmm. So let's say I give you two options. Either I give you an apple, or I give you an apple and you give me $2. The rational choice, hypothetically, is you pick the apple. Because why would you give me $2? You don't have to give me $2. There's no reason to do that. So this is a very technical definition of rationality. So what I'm not talking about is Commander Spock. This is the straw man version of rationality. Who talks really monotone and says some stupid numbers or whatever. That's not what I'm talking about. For me, rationality is much closer to not being stupid than it is to being smart. Being smart is far more about your world model, your epistemology, and so on. Being rational is just about not being predictably stupid. If you don't know a piece of information, maybe if you take the apple, they'll give me $2, I'll, shoot you afterwards, and I didn't tell you about that or something, or I'll poison the apple or something. If you didn't know about that, that's not a mistake per se, because you didn't know about it. But if you did know about it and you'd make the decision anyways, well, then you're irrational to some degree. These things get more complicated once it gets into social things. So unfortunately, once you deal with social scenarios, things get even more complicated, because now irrationality often becomes a good strategy, because the actions of other people depend on your actions and your mind. So if you perceive me as someone who is fanatically loyal to you, just completely delusionally loyal to you, do anything you want, whatever, even if it doesn't make sense for me, well, you might promote me to, high commander. It seems like a good right-hand man for me, the dictator, or whatever. So if you want to be the right-hand man, the dictator, it can be useful to damage your own rationality, your own epistemology and decision theory in order to rise the ranks, as an example. So things get very messy very suddenly when you're dealing with social situations where other people are thinking about your mind and who you are as a person. This is very hard to reason about. There's no easy way to do it. There's no simple trick. Oh, here's how you solve all social problems. And we'll go, it's hard.
Right. Is it fair to say, ultimately we're bundles of evolved biases, and pleasing a local group who we feel affiliated to is one of those biases? And
I dislike the bias framing personally.
Okay.
I think biases are a thing, but I think they are vastly overhyped, especially in online high IQ autistic nerd circles. A lot of biases, quote unquote, exist for actually very good reasons. Wanting to please your tribe might be a bias, but it's there for a good reason. It's because, in fact, often pleasing your tribe in many situations is a good strategy. It might involve you compromising in other things, such as compromising on your epistemology, on your rationality in various ways. But in a sense, this can be a good strategy. it can also not be, of course. And so biases are real. I'm just saying it's actually tricky. Like there's no, aha, I have a list of biases and I simply won't do those. Unfortunately, it's not that simple.
Okay. So getting back to the question of, let's say, very smart people doing polar opposite things, let's say Jeffrey Hinton and Yakun, am I understanding correct that they are applying their rationality towards different goals and ends, or maybe they hold different values, even though they
Yeah.
might be equally smart?
Yeah. And they can also just be less rational or more rational. I mean, look, if I told you CEO of, General Oil says climate change, no big deal, is your update, wow, the CEO of General Oil, he's pretty smart. So maybe this whole climate change isn't real. Or is your response, well, duh, he's the CEO of General Oil. Like duh. I'm sure he's smart, and he's using his smarts to prevent us from lowering his stock price.
Yeah. But again, I mean, let's say Jeffrey Hinton would have had a very high paying job at Google and prestigious job also. There was something in his character to quit it and start going around talking about this AI risk. So
It's
obviously
very
incentives would
possible.
explain partially people's behavior, but there's something else that's
Of
driving
course.
some of the people on the frontier to
Of course.
risk their
They're
reputation and other things.
Humans are not simple. Like this is incentives. People do have personalities. It's very fashionable to think of humans as purely products of their environment, blank slate, just incentive gradients and whatever. But this isn't actually true. It is to a large degree, to a larger degree than many people think. And there are some people who are fully explainable by their environment. Like there are people who I have in the past said unkind things about revolving corpses, and they are fully explainable by their environment. And now maybe it feels like them internally. They have some kind of personality, they have some core, they whatever, and they might, right? But I don't know what's in other people's brains. Like I don't know what's inside your soul. I don't know what's in your mind. How could I? So the question is far more, can I predict your behavior from a given set of variables? And for some people, the set of variables needed to predict them includes a lot of internal state and their family history and whatever. For other people, nah, you just look at their job title and this predicts their behavior.
Okay, got it. So I'm going to ask you to dissect the long reply you made to Roon recently. I think it was fascinating. I've read it a number of times. I think he said something like this: it's okay to watch and wonder about the dance of gods and the clash of titans, but it's not good to fret about the outcome. Political culture encourages us to think that generalized anxiety is equivalent to civic duty. So can you break this down and maybe also explain who Roon is and what's your interpretation of this tweet was, and generally what you make of it?
Yeah, so I'd like to start with a content warning. So far we've been engaging in object level questions. We've been talking about things in very clear, modern, rational terms. Whether you agree with me or not, dear listener, I've been trying to communicate things that are like actual claims about actual things, or at least are about my opinions. Where we're about to go is kind of a bit of a different territory, a different kind of epistemological theory. So Roon is a Twitter user who works at OpenAI, and he has a great sense of humor. He's a really great writer. He writes really funny, weird, quippy, crazy stuff. He's a really interesting guy. Like I like reading his stuff a lot. I think he has a really fun personality. I think he's very smart and says a lot of funny things. And he also uses a lot of mystical language and mystical thinking and so on in his brand of humor and thinking, which I think is fun and cool and interesting. And so recently, Roon wrote the thing that Paras just read out, and this kind of sparked me to wanting to reply to this. And as you can see, it's written, the dance of gods and so on in a mystical language. So where we're going to go now is into what I would call mystical language or mysticism. So if you don't mind, Paras, I'd like to take just 5 or 10 minutes to maybe talk about what is mysticism from my perspective. Would that be okay?
That'll be great.
Great. So my response to this tweet, which you're going to get to in a second, is very dripping with a certain non-rational language. It's less about science and biases and so on, and far more about spirits and gods and magic and so on. And in our modern culture, it's usually these things are very frowned upon. They're seen as, old superstitions from a previous era, an unenlightened era before we understood, the modern scientific method and so on. And to first approximation, that's correct. To second approximation, that's not quite correct. So when I talk about mysticism, what I really mean is metaphors. The using of irrational language. The point is to delimitate a concept, to enumerate a concept. I'm like, okay, I want to make this claim. I make this claim, and maybe I provide some evidence or whatever, and then we combine these various pieces using logical rules to get to some kind of conclusion. Of course, in practice, it's never that perfect, but hypothetically, if I was in an academic context, I'm supposed to make arguments that are logically coherent, that follow a certain structure, that don't contradict themselves, and that result, that follow to some conclusion that we can evaluate and think about. Mysticism, for me, is loosening those constraints. It's going from, like the most extreme form of rationality is like formal proofs, formal logic, like mathematics. Then there's the intermediate kind of like, science, academia, which is like not quite as rigorous as mathematics. It's actually a lot less rigorous than people think it is. But there's still rigor there. Like you're still trying to use rational, reasonable, logical thought. And then there's a spectrum that goes even further towards the mystical, where it becomes more about metaphors. It becomes more about vibes, feelings, emotions, stories. It no longer becomes about statements so much as stories. So when in a fable, you talk about a frog and a scorpion, you don't literally mean there was literally a frog, literally at a river with literally a scorpion, and they were literally talking. This is obviously not what you mean. So mystic language is more like fiction writing, and fiction is actually very capable at discussing and pointing at useful concepts that are very, very, very hard to talk about in formal language, especially emotions, relationships between people, how people think about themselves, and stuff like this. It's quite hard to elucidate, fervor is love or hate or whatever using just a math proof. It's possible, as many mathematicians will tell you, but it's not easy. And it's not legible to most people. Because the natural way for humans to communicate is actually mystical. It's actually normal for people to communicate through religious metaphors and storytelling, more so than modern rational thought. This is actually a relatively recent invention. The oldest civilization, like artifacts of civilization we know, like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, is a temple. It's not a granary. Yeah. It's not a thing. It's a temple. Like humanity started with religion, and I think the reason this is still useful is that there are just some things that have not been digested yet. Like for me, rationality is the most digested, powerful, refined version of mystic thought. It's so powerful, it's so refined that there's no ambiguity, hypothetically. We know I say a thing and we're like, yep, okay, cool. Fully understood. There's no misunderstanding, hypothetically, etc. And so mystic thought allows you to, and mystic language allows you to talk about more things, but things become more open to confusion, misinterpretation, wishful thinking, etc. So there's a trade-off. So where we're going now is talking about things which don't have good, rational, simple, compact words. I think they can. I think, after years and decades of digesting this stuff, of coming up with new ways of talking about this, better theories of psychology, better theories of sociology, and so on, we could develop rational methods for talking about these things, but we don't really have that right now. So I resort to metaphors. So for the rational, audience here, don't take the things I said to Roon, or the Roon says to me, as literally true. Try to think of them as metaphors and think of them what they might be metaphors for. What are they pointing to in your concept space? So rant over. I just want to have that little disclaimer here is that I understand that this is not literally true. I'm not retarded. I'm not crazy. I'm not schizophrenic. Like I understand that there aren't literally spirits and there's not literally magic. Duh. Sure. Everything is mechanistic, but it can be useful to use this language to talk about these kinds of things.
Yeah. So, all this, this of course makes it so much more interesting because there's just some concepts that you simply can't explain efficiently unless you end up using metaphors. So concepts like God, underworld, spirits, a lot of things, I think they they take on this character, which is just super hard to communicate, and maybe it'll diffuse the whole meaning if you try to put them into literal, rational words.
Yes, it can be very difficult. I think it's possible, but it's hard. So like it's often useful to use these like mystical languages, say like underworld, spirits, God, and whatever, to conjure a set of properties, like a big, multi-dimensional embedding of a bunch of stuff. And then it can be very helpful to combine these concepts in different ways to create intersections, to narrow in on like, look, I'm pointing at something.
Right.
And it can be frustrating because people might say, well, you're not literally pointing at something. And I'm like, yes, I'm pointing in a direction. Look there. So like a lot of mystical language is not about, here's the solution, write it down. It's, hey, you see this direction I'm pointing at? There's something there. Keep looking. I would love to show it to you precisely, but I can't. So you have to go looking yourself. So a lot of what I'm trying to do here is not to say, here's literally the solution that applies literally to you in your literal life. It's more like, hey, I'm going to point out a little teeny corner of your brain that you may have not considered before. Start poking around there and see what you find.
Sure.
So this is how I think about this. So to return to the Roon tweet.
Yeah. So what is
maybe,
the dance of gods he's talking about? And
yes,
why does he recommend not fretting about the outcome? And what outcome possibly he must be meaning by this?
So I, of course, don't know exactly what Roon thinks in his head, but my interpretation of what Roon is saying, I hope he thinks I'm not misinterpreting him here. The dance of gods is the idea that there are structures, there are things that are larger than individual humans that are the primary drivers of what happens in our world. In a physical sense, this is nonsense. Of course, everything's made out of people to some degree, good people and their machines and their livestock. But if you rephrase this even slightly, it actually becomes pretty obvious what these gods are. They're stuff like nations, corporations. Where is Google? Where is Google located? Where's the physical? Sure, you can point to their office, but it's not Google. When Google sues the EU, who is Google and who is the EU? Sure, they have lawyers. You can point to the lawyers, but they're not the EU. So who is this EU? And what's he made out of? And so these are what interchangeably can be called egregores, gods, emergent, again, agentic structure, whatever you want to call it. Basically, there are ways in which you can view reality where it is useful to speak about groups or emergent gods as themselves agentic entities. One of my favorite examples, which is like a bit mystical tinged of this, is from, I think it was one of Yuval Harari's books, where he talks about how the Egyptians believed in the god Sobek, the crocodile god, that he controlled the flooding of the Nile. Now, of course, in some sense, this is not literally true. But I forgot which century and which pharaoh it was, but one of the pharaohs basically got, who was, the story went that he was the incarnation of Sobek. And he collected, this massive amount of workers who over like 40 years built this incredibly complicated, huge dam system, which allowed them to control the flooding. So in a sense, who controls the flooding of the Nile now? The answer, Sobek, is not insane. It's not insane to say that Sobek does, in fact, control the flooding of the Nile in this situation. Now, Sobek is not a physical thing. There's not actually a guy with a crocodile head who is like waving his hand and making the Nile go up and down. But in a non-trivial sense, if you went to this land and you asked who is controlling the Nile, and they say Sobek, this is a useful answer. This is a sensible way to make sense of this. Similarly, when you say who developed GPT-4 and you answer OpenAI, this is a useful answer to me. Even so, OpenAI is not a guy somewhere on a computer who developed GPT-4. It's still useful to say OpenAI. So we can think of corporations, nations, groups of peoples as gods. This is the closest concept we have from our ancestral environment. The same way we would call Sobek a god, we can call OpenAI a god, or the United States of America a god, and so on. And as we know from our histories and our mythologies, gods are very fickle and strange creatures who don't really, they have a lot of human traits. but never quite. They're always odd. They have weird demands and they act sometimes in bizarre ways. Sometimes they're extremely good and sometimes they're extremely evil. Sometimes they just do shit that doesn't make any goddamn sense. And this points to a real phenomenon in how bureaucracies, groups can act in ways that are very bizarre. Like no normal person would act this way, but they can also accomplish great things. They have great power. They can cause incredible things to happen in the world that an individual human can't cause, at least not without becoming a god or a part of a god. So another way to think about what a god is that you could kind of think about human minds as computers that are running software. And you can think of gods as computer programs that are running distributed on many human minds. Shards of gods run on many minds. A shard of the United States government runs in my mind, because I believe in them to some degree and I act in accordance to them. A shard of my company, Conjecture, runs in my mind because I act in the name of this god, this corporation, this entity, and so on. So you could think of them as distributed computer programs that are running on society. And so when Roon talks about the dance of the gods, he's talking about how these computer programs are interacting, how these groups, these entities are fighting or allying or mutating or otherwise doing things. And if you look at the news and you listen with this in mind, this framing in mind, you will hear that they, to a massive degree, talk about gods, not about people. They talk about, and often they talk about people. They only talk of people as avatars of gods. Joe Biden, the president of the United States of America, the avatar of the god of the United States, and so on. So massive amounts of global events are basically fully in the hands of gods. They're not in the hands of people. Now, people are parts of gods, and people can affect gods, but it's useful to think of them as two different things, as two different layers of abstraction, so to speak. Does that make sense?
Yes. This relates to, a couple of points. One is that with gods, I think automatically a sense of being powerless comes. That's a connotation that the word God implies. And I think that relates to what you said, that SF is where you go if you want to sell every last scrap of your mind, body, and soul, which is related to giving up agency in front of gods. Is that what you meant by it, that we shouldn't necessarily feel powerless in front of gods, that we can impact how they behave, what they behave?
So gods are made of people, or at least they run on people. And the way a god is shaped and formed depends on the people it is running on and the way that people interact with it. There is a kind of helplessness here where some gods are extremely powerful and many of them are predatory. This is so in Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene, he introduces the concept of the selfish gene. We talked about that through evolution. The actual selfish bit is a piece of DNA. Is that DNA is trying to get itself copied. Now, this is not because DNA has a mind. It's because if you're a piece of DNA that, if it's in an organism, causes more of that organism to exist, well, then there's going to be more of you. So if you look into the world and look at the DNA in the world, you should expect to find DNA that is good at copying itself. This is not a value judgment. It's just a thing that happens. And Dawkins in the same book also introduced this concept of a meme, which is, nowadays is a word for a joke on the internet. But what it meant originally is the psychological or informational equivalent of a gene. It's a piece of information that copies itself, a piece of information that will, keep itself, known. And it kind of makes sense, right? If you are introduced to a new culture, you've never been before, you don't know anything about them, and you look at what art is the most well-known, it's probably going to be good. On average, if you sample the art randomly, some art will be vastly overrepresented, either because it has some historical consequence, or because it's really easy to remember, or it's very cheap, or it's very cool, it's very fun, it's very good, whatever. There will be some reason that this is the most widely spread art. It's not random. It's not like art is evenly, uniformly distributed, that every art is equally well represented. This is obviously not how it works. And it makes sense because there is competition. But like in nature, nature red in tooth and claw, the best strategies for replication aren't necessarily nice. It's not necessarily being the best at something. It can also mean being the most predatory. So if you have, for an example of this is evangelicalism or evangelical religions in general, not specifically Christianity, but just any form of any form of religion, which has a very strong component of spreading itself.
Right.
If you have a religion which says we're the best religion, and maybe it is, but don't tell anyone about it, what happens to this religion in one generation?
Yeah.
Well, it's gone. It could have been as great as it wants. If you didn't tell anyone, it doesn't matter. Now, let's say you have a religion. Let's say it's a pretty shit religion. It's like really bad. It hurts people, whatever. But it fervently forces people, at gunpoint to spread it to as many people as possible. Well, that one might stick around.
Yeah.
Makes sense. And so obviously there's a huge trade-off between all these different things. But yeah, so it's very tempting as an individual. You see, you're kind of at sea. You're kind of like, there's all these like gods vying for your brain space. There's all these entities. So sometimes I use words like psychic or spiritual to talk about really what I mean is mimetic. Is that you are being constantly, everything is trying to get your attention. Because the things that get your attention are the things that survive. Those are the things that will be produced. If some meme can convince you to convince your friends of it, well, that meme will stick around. So there is an evolutionary arms race, the same way that we have an evolutionary arms race with like viruses and bacteria. Is that, of course, viruses and bacteria, they want to use all our nice cells to reproduce. Similarly, memes want to use our nice brains in order to reproduce. So we are constantly in an evolutionary arms race against these things. They're trying to take control of us. They're trying to make us things.
There's a small caveat here. These memes or gods, they obviously have to be at least somewhat beneficial for you to give your attention. At least in the short term. So you'll only adopt something, even if a religion was really, really bad in the long term, but you would only pay heed to a god if that god offers you some solace, some benefit, or lures you into something that you find beneficial. Otherwise, you wouldn't give that god your mind space.
Hypothetically, yes, but in practice, man, do I spend a lot of time on Twitter. So this is correct. You are correct in general. The problem is that the mind is not perfectly shielded. Like we don't have also the mind is not some our immune systems are themselves mimetic. And it's the same thing as well, we would never allow a virus into our cells if it was not beneficial. So the viruses must give us some kind of benefit. Well, the answer is no. Sometimes your immune system just fucks up. Sometimes you just make a mistake. It can be a useful way to get past your mimetic immune system to offer you a short-term benefit. This is a very common strategy, especially in memes, to do this. But it's not necessary. And it's not necessary. There are ways to infiltrate your mind without giving you anything beneficial. This is possible. Not saying it's the best strategy or it's the most common, but it is possible.
Does any example come into your mind wherein something which is...
I can think of many examples. Yeah, here's a really stark one, anorexia. So anorexia can be spread mimetically. There's a lot of studies on this where if young girls are exposed to people talking about anorexia or showing anorexia, they can develop anorexia at much, much larger levels than they would otherwise. There's, for example, I was thinking South Korea and Japan, the word, the concept of anorexia didn't really exist. And then psychologists start to introduce these terms and suddenly the wreck is shot up. And now some people will say, well, anorexia always existed but wasn't diagnosed. But this doesn't match up because anorexia in particular is so bad that people often die or have to go to the hospital because of malnutrition, so you can't hide it. So this is a very specific example of a very virulent mimetic virus, which gives no benefit. It just makes them miserable. It's a horrible experience. I don't know if you've had anyone in your family or someone with anorexia. It's awful. It's a terrible experience for people. They no benefit from it. It hurts them severely. It can kill people. This is an unusually clean example. There are many examples that are on the spectrum from this unusually clean example.
Got it. So, you also said you watch many good-hearted tech folks practically give away agency. Is that related to what you're talking about? Because their minds are infiltrated by some gods or memes that aren't necessarily on their side?
Absolutely. There's always a large, as I say, it's a predatory world. We're swimming in a swamp, a primordial ooze of evolutionary pressure of viruses. There's it's surprising how bad our norms around epistemic hygiene are about mimetic hygiene. Like people just like turn on the news or like scroll through Twitter for hours per day and like, yeah, this is fine. Like the way you should think about it is like it's putting your hands into like dirty slime. Like wash your hands. Like what are you doing? Like if you just dunk your hand into the infected slime, yeah, it's gonna be bad for you. And like wash your hands, goddamn. And people truly don't wash their hands to a surprising large degree. There is surprisingly so we talked a bit earlier about how people feel this helplessness. I think a lot of this helplessness is that people don't have these terms to talk about it. So even before we had germ theory, this was how we were dealing with physical illnesses as well. Is we didn't have a concept really that like drinking some things were bad, or that not washing your hands before or during surgery is bad. Like when doctors first said we should start washing our hands before doing surgery, mind you, he was run out of medicine. He lost his job. He was vilified. He was like lost literally everything. It's a great story. You should I forgot his name, unfortunately. But yeah, everyone was like hated this guy. They destroyed his entire career. I'm not sure if he committed suicide, but like at least was close to it. So truly awful story. And now from our perspective, we're like, what the what? Like, of course you wash your hands before you do surgery. What the hell are you thinking about? And I think we're at a similar phase right now where we're in the pre-hand washing era of like information consumption. I think part of this is because for a very long time, there wasn't that much slime. We didn't have, before we had radio, before we had television, before we had the internet, the amount of like negative mimetic information you could be exposed to is relatively low. So the pressure towards developing mimetic resistance was relatively low. It still existed, but it was relatively low. The same way how before we had cities, there weren't really pandemics. There was much less evolutionary pressure on viruses and bacteria to develop pandemic level replication without cities. And then after, like, there's a great, one of my favorite, mysteries, quote unquote, is when the Spanish came to America, they brought smallpox with them and it ravaged the North American continent. Why didn't the Spanish get sick with mysterious North American diseases? Like, why didn't they bring, America pox back to Spain? And the usual explanation for this is that there weren't as many dense cities with bad sanitation in North America. There were some cities, but they were smaller and there weren't as many of them. And general sanitation was not quite as bad as in European cities. So the viruses and the bacteria that developed in Europe were just a million times more virulent and, evolved in a sense than the ones that were common in North America at the time. And there's a similar thing going on with the internet right now, where the internet is a cesspool of mimetic evolution. It's a spawning ground, a primordial ooze from which, we have this intense competition of more and more mentally ill, teenagers coming up with more and more deranged memes and more deranged culture war issues, more and more whatever to hack people's minds as quickly as possible. This is kind of where we're at right now. And so when talking about these people that you're talking about, these good-hearted nerds, 3 years ago, when we talked last time, I was more optimistic about this because I hadn't yet witnessed in its full horror how much, I kind of thought what you were talking about earlier, but LeCun is a smart man, so why is he doing this? I used to believe a similar thing because I was like, well, if people are smart, they'll be able to resist memes and think for themselves, right?
Yeah.
Right? But there's a saying where people think cults are for stupid people, and those people themselves are probably vulnerable to cults. Cults are not just for stupid people. Cults affect very smart people all the time. This is a very common phenomenon, and it's one that I think people are so uncomfortable with this fact. Most people in the common world are so uncomfortable with the fact that many of the worst cults attract very intelligent and very academic people that they don't even think about what this should teach us, what we can learn from this. I'm fascinated by Leahy and other extreme elite cults, which are deranged. You read their literature and whatever, and it's insane. It's complete madness. Yet it attracted top intelligentsia, top scientists, top engineers to their ranks. And this should teach us something. It should say, like, what's going on here? And then to pull from the extreme example back to the concrete example, how many of us have heard, it's become a meme in the Western sphere, of like, I was just following orders. But let's be honest. We all know someone who said something like that before, even for ourselves. You work for a big company, got to do something, maybe not quite so comfortable with. But I mean, it's your boss's fault. He makes a decision. So you can let it happen, right?
Right.
Sure, you're building AGI, which, might kill everybody. You don't really have a plan. But look, you're just an engineer. You're just following orders. It's not your job to figure out how to solve it. You just build technology. Right. And this is very common.
So is that what Roon meant by don't fret about the outcome?
So I think this is the uncharitable interpretation, which is the one I'm picking. I'm not instantly charitable, just for fun. I think charity has its point, and sometimes you shouldn't be charitable. Sometimes you should be, sometimes you shouldn't be. I think the charitable interpretation is that he's saying, look, bro, if you're just some guy, fuck it. Like, you can't do anything. You're too stupid. You're too weak. Don't even try. And this is a harsh message, but there is some truth to it. And this is something I struggle with as well. I don't have a good answer to this question. Is that, man, the world is actually complicated. Like fuck me. Like, the world is actually hard, right? It's like,
it is. I
could tell some oil, grad student, be like, bro, like, climate change. And he will answer like, okay, well, what do I do? I have 95 IQ and a family that I have to feed. And also my mom is dying of cancer. Like, what do I do? And this is actually a good question. Like, I want to have sympathy here. So there's a cynical, snarky version of this where, like, people are bad. Like, people have no moral consciousness. They have no spine. They're cowards. They will just do what's locally good, best for them, whatever. And I mean, this is true, but it's not compassionate. It's not the proper compassion that I think should be had here. The proper compassion that should be had here is that the world is fucking hard. And being a human is fucking hard. Taking care of your family is fucking hard. Taking care of your mental health is fucking hard. There's no, like, we're all in this together, right? It's the human condition. It is actually a struggle. And sure, we could be like, ha ha ha, look, me living in a first world country, from, loving middle class background. I'm going to look down on you because because you're like a struggling, single mom, who can't, has no time to think about serious issues. But that's just not productive. Like, what the fuck are you doing? Like, shut the fuck up. Like, it's easy to fall to cynicism. It's easy to be like, well, no one's going to do anything. Everyone's bad, blah, blah, blah. I understand. But this is not productive. We have to simply see that it is actually hard. Fighting gods, building gods is hard. It takes resources. It takes luck. It takes, being healthy. If you're just sick, like, well, damn, like, what do you do? Like, fuck, it's just, so I have a lot of compassion. And I truly, truly have compassion for people. And I do think it is true. And this is something I struggle with. So in my personal relationships, a pattern that I often struggle with is that sometimes people will, like, very normal, nice people, just normal people living their normal lives, people I meet at a party or whatever. They'll want my opinion on something. They want to know, like, what's really going on. They want that, like, Connor, like, tell me how it is. Or they want me to psychoanalyze them or something. Because, like, often people get a feeling that I'm good at reading people or whatever, and they want me to, like, psychoanalyze them. They want me to talk to them about spirituality. They want me to tell them what's wrong with them. And I usually don't, partially because this is not my responsibility and, like, I shouldn't do this. And also it's because it will just hurt them often. Like, I can tell, like, but what happens quite often with my mom is, like, I'll have a call with my mom. I'll tell her how I'm doing and so on. And she'll be like, she really wants to know what I'm doing and, like, really what's going on in the world. And, I'll tell her what I'm doing, whatever. And she gets so scared, about the world, about politics, about AI and so on. And almost always it concludes with just like, but you're okay, honey, right? I say, yes, mom, I'm okay. Don't worry about it. And I think this is actually compassionate. And, like, I love my mom and she loves me more than anything in the world. But she can't do what I do. She has responsibilities to the rest of the family. She doesn't have the same kind of personality traits, the same set of education that I necessarily do to be able to run a company, to run political campaigning, and so on. And I do not think it is a good thing. Both, I think it's unfair to these people to look down on them, but also at the same time, what's the point in making them upset? Like, what's the point in like making them fret and scared and frightened? I can make them aware of all the towering titans, all the monsters and the devils that are around us. But does it help? So I think what Roon is saying here, I think is actually something compassionate. And I want to give Roon credit for this. I think this comes from a place of love. I don't think Roon is a bad person. I think what he's saying here is coming from a place of love. I think what he's saying is like, if you're all just worried about all these demons that you can do nothing about, you're just going to be scared. You're just going to be upset, and it's not going to help fight the demons. So like, don't fret about it. Enjoy your life. Be good to your neighbors. Be good to your family. Do what you can. And I do respect this, and I struggle myself with this dichotomy of, on the one hand, I want my mom to just take care of herself, take care of her family, back home, be happy, and like just don't worry about the politics. Like I'll handle it. But on the other hand, I'm also like, God fucking damn it, someone has to handle the politics.
Yeah, yeah. And on that note, I mean, keeping almost everyone apart who can't really influence the course of AI, but there are people who have a huge amount of influence. Roon, I'm sure, has influence, and OpenAI is probably 400, 500 people. What do you have to say about them? Like what moral responsibility they have? And it find it, I mean, of course, everyone notices this. Let's say Sam Altman goes around talking about dangers of AI, yet he and his group of people are the same ones building it. And that to me is cognitively dissonant. So what's happening there?
Yeah. So there's a reason that I yelled at Roon and not my mom. Let me put it that way. The reason I wrote this long Twitter post calling out Roon rather scathingly is because, like, bro, like, this is cope. Like, Roon is obviously not my mom. Like, my mom obviously can't do what Roon can do. Obviously, Roon is extremely intelligent. He's extremely capable. He's charming. Like, he's in a good spot. He has capital, both social and otherwise. Like, so it's in my aesthetics. So sometimes I'll meet someone like this. And when I meet someone like this, I like to hit them with the verbal equivalent of a bamboo rod. So like in Buddhism, there's this thing where when the student gets distracted, you hit their hands with a bamboo rod, because it doesn't really cause permanent damage, but it hurts like hell. I don't know if you've ever had, oh God, it hurts so bad. And so the point is to draw attention to something, to be like, wake up, like what the fuck are you talking about? Wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up. And this was kind of like, this post I wrote was not really meant for other people. It was for Roon. It was like, I saw like a man who has great potential, who I think is sleeping, and I want to hit him and be like, wake up. In practice, this never works. Sorry, all Buddhist masters out there and so on, or like people who hope, but in practice, this doesn't work. Hitting people and making them wake up doesn't work. There's reasons why it doesn't work. It usually works temporarily, and usually just go back to sleep because their social environment is optimized to put them back to sleep. Right. Usually you need to hit people with a rod and then also move them out of their social context into a different social context, which reinforces reflection. Or you need to do what I call bootstrapping, which is a whole other topic I hope to write more about in the future. Ever since this post, and even before that, I was thinking a lot about this question of, okay, but what if you can't move social contexts and you want to keep awake? What do you do? And the process I call is bootstrapping, which is this idea of what are the things you need to do to not fall back asleep and keep going? And what is the minimum set of things? What is the smallest commitment that if you do this, or like something in this category, you will continue to improve and you'll reach escape velocity, kind of like spiritual escape velocity. You'll start reflecting, you'll get better and better and better.
But it has to come from within, right? It has to be initiated by the person.
Yes. Ultimately, if you don't want to, whatever. Like, if you ultimately, to go to the underworld, you have to want to go to the underworld. Otherwise, you can always turn back.
It's sort of like you need to escalate your commitment so that you ultimately come out of the situation you are in.
There needs to be something you're fighting for, or there needs to be something you want to protect. The most common way, other than accidental or forced entry into the underworld, the call to adventure is usually not an active thing, like on the part of the adventurer per se. It's usually that the valley is threatened. It's usually you are protecting. It's usually the adventurer wants to save the valley. It wants to protect other people. And to do that, they have to go to the underworld. This is how things usually go. Having something to protect is a very powerful way to motivate and to reason about yourself and keep yourself accountable. I think it is, in a sense, a more healthy driver than the raw will to power. I think the raw will to power is predictably disruptible. Like if you just want power for yourself, there's like no way to not become a villain. If you want to protect and you need power, the will to power to get there, I think this is how heroes are made. Is, the hero is the intersection between the will to protect and the will to power, because you need both. Otherwise, you're just another demigod, ascending for his own selfish needs, and a new predator in the field.
I think everyone has a self-image in which they are doing whatever they're doing for the good, and I'm sure OpenAI has a narrative where they're trying to create a lot of value in the world, and they don't actively see themselves as,
of course, this is why
who could be doing evil things, right?
Exactly. And so this is exactly why I gave the warning about mystic talking and mystic language, is that a story isn't sufficient to be a hero. Like, you're not the good guy because you follow a narrative structure. This is simply insufficient. There's no way to take, I think I'm a good person, and therefore concluding you are a good person. The step doesn't exist. And you can take the reason mysticism is dangerous is that it allows anything. In a proof system, in a math system, if you construct it correctly, it should only allow you to make correct proofs. Like incorrect ones are just, at least in a constructive system, blah, blah, blah. You can't even make wrong ones. Like, it's just not allowed. Or, they get assigned false or whatever. This is not the case outside of mathematics. You can give me literally anything right now. I promise you. You can give me anything and I can justify it. I can come up with an argument that justifies anything. Any sufficiently smart person can do this. Like anyone who has a sufficiently high verbal IQ and has read enough fiction and a little bit of psychoanalysis can justify literally anything in any context. And so one conclusion you can draw from this is that, well, I guess morality is completely arbitrary. I'll just do whatever the fuck I want. Fuck you. This is one thing you can draw from this. Another thing you can draw from this is that, wow, morality is actually hard. And I can't actually guarantee that I am good just by thinking it. This is just not sufficient. Right. And then you have to think about larger things. You have to think about your social system. You have to think about your own incentives. You have to think about yourself from third person. You have to think about not just, who do I think I am, but like in practice, what is the entity that inhabits my body? What is it? What is it doing? And where is it steering? Because by default, the humans are really good at convincing themselves that, whatever they're doing is good. And it's very, very hard to evaluate this in any objective sense, in the fungible, and even non-trivial. I'm not even saying the one true goodness. I'm saying just like not obviously stupid. Even this is really hard. And if you're in a bad social situation or an irreflexive system, if you don't have control over your emotions, if you don't eat well, sleep well, have family and friends, if you don't have these things, it's almost impossible. It's almost impossible. It's really hard. It's really, really hard. It's possible, but it's really hard. And it takes effort and it takes energy and it takes a will to power to a certain degree. Like, you have to be willing to fight gods.
Right.
Like, another blogger called Zvi wrote a little bit about that post I wrote. And one of the things he said is that, like, at the end of the post is that, like, Roon is kind of saying is that, well, look, the world is run by Cthulhu. Cthulhu is some powerful god. We're fucked, just live with it. And from his perspective, what I'm saying is, to a certain degree, like, yeah, the world is run by Cthulhu and you have to punch him. And this is insane. Punching Cthulhu is insane. Cthulhu is much stronger than you. You're just a human. But this is the only way out. Like
Yeah.
either Cthulhu eats you or you find some fucking way to punch him. I'm not saying I know how to punch him, but like you need to find out something. And someone needs to. If you don't do it, someone needs to punch Cthulhu. And this is kind of a lot of how I think about these kind of things. I'm not saying, look, I am the Messiah. Here's the things you do in this order, and then everything turns out fine. Not what I'm saying. I'm saying is, holy shit, Cthulhu is running the planet. No one seems to currently have a plan how to build a Cthulhu killer weapon or what to do with the corpse afterwards. We should probably figure that out like right now.
Yeah. And apparently a lot of smart people are sort of infected by these mind viruses gods, which
of course. So there is a deeper
not even
thing
acknowledge there is this thing going around.
Oh yeah, like one of the biggest, like the biggest quote unquote spiritual skill or magical skill, like the most important one, is reflection. The ability to reason about your own thoughts. This is much harder than people think it is, especially because your emotions will actively hinder you in gaining access to your own mind. It's actually hard. Like many people think that we have like privileged access to our own minds, that, whatever you think is what you think. But that's not true.
Yeah.
What you think is often not what you think. Say that 3 times fast. And this is actually tricky. Like the human condition is you are a faulty algorithm running on faulty hardware with incomplete access to itself that is supposed to reason about itself to improve itself while surrounded in an adversarial environment of constant programs made by much stronger programmers than you who are trying to hack you. This is the human condition. This is the underworld. The underworld is the thing below consensus narrative reality. It's the murmurs, the sludge, the creatures, the worms, everything that underlie the infrastructure, the pillars, upon the psychic pillars upon which everything stands. And once you actually look down, you'd be like, oh shit, there's a bunch of shit down there. And a lot of that shit's in your head. A lot of it is like trauma and like weird, desires that you maybe not reflexive upon. A lack of education. You just never learned how to think about your own thoughts. You just never practiced. It's just like, there's so much shit. Like, in a sense, if it was only gods, that's already bad enough. But there's also a bunch of other shit. There's like this psychofauna, like psychic creatures. Gods are one of them, but there's other ones as well. There's various kinds of demons that are in your head, and they can come from all kinds of trauma or physical injury or whatever, can cause demons to appear in your head that you have to deal with, or that will inhibit you in some ways. And it's truly very hard to deal with this, and there's no general purpose solution. So there's one more thing I want to bring up before we move on to any other topic, which is there's no easy way to talk about this. This is maybe the hardest part of this to talk about. I didn't talk about it in my tweet because it was too hard to talk about. I'm going to try, and I'm probably going to fail. There's a deeper sense where there is nothing in our brain but gods. Is that separating you from the other things doesn't actually make sense. You isn't really a thing. There is various patterns that claim to be Parashchopra. And these patterns are very different depending on the time of day, which person you're around, what social context you're in, whether you've eaten recently or not, whether you got hit on the head or not, and many other things. The soul is not only in your brain, it's very distributed. The thing that you would call the soul, like the person, is distributed to your friends, your family, your social networks, your tools, your writing, your the art you have hanging in your house. It's all part of you in some sense. And in a sense, you are a very big thing. And there's some things that are less you. The paintings on your wall are less you than the brain in your head is you. But it is you, a little bit. It's a little bit you. And I am a little bit you, because we've known each other and we've talked. Not a lot, I don't know you particularly well, but there's a little bit of Parashchopra in my head, a little bit. And there's a little bit of me in you, a little bit. And so this is very messy. So it can be useful to think about just like, okay, I am a fortress and these gods are trying to enter my fortress. But this is actually also not true. It's more like you're also a spirit. You're also a god. You're also this thing spread across psychic reality, and you're mixing with all these other things to various degrees. And you don't have full control over the mixing. Like, you can meet someone and they'll just like say stuff to you and it enters your brain. And now you think differently. So it's very hard to reason and to think about how do you build yourself? How do you create this god, this entity, this hero, whatever? It's not just you decide one day, yep, I'm a good guy now. Hell yeah, this is what I'm going to do now. That easy. You're made of many parts.
That's almost like one god that you identify with as self, trying to take control of all other gods, and that rarely happens.
Exactly. You got it. Like, this is a good way of thinking about it. This is like the Buddhist way of thinking about it. So the self is just another illusion. It's just like the punchline I talk about in the post. It's the punchline of like going all the way into the underworld. The full shamanic enlightenment is there are no spirits. There never were any spirits, but like, of course not. Like, the world is mechanistic. There's no magic. There's no spirits. There's just people and words and language and stuff. Like, it's all mechanistic. It's all atoms deep down. That doesn't mean it can't be useful to talk about them, but fundamentally there is no mystery here. It's nothing magical. It's understandable. It's a hard thing to understand. It's one of the complex parts of reality, but it's just reality. Everything adds up to normality. Right. And so the takeaway of like good, I claim, if you take my spirituality here, it shouldn't be like you come out of this and you're completely destabilized. You're like, whoa, my soul is everywhere, dude. What you should come out of this is like, oh yeah, huh. And then, you just like, you're still you. Like, it shouldn't change who you are. You were always like this. And the whole, like the Zen position might be like, you were always enlightened. Like, you've always been enlightened. You just didn't notice. Like, it's just how it always, I don't quite agree with the Zen position on here, but I think it's a nice aesthetic. And it's similar here. It's like, look, it's not like if I inform you about the existence of gods, it's not like they didn't exist previously. If I inform you that you're this psychic cloud, it doesn't mean you weren't a psychic cloud before. It's just you were listening to this one story about you being oneself in your brain. This one god, this one, monotheistic, like even more monotheistic than monotheistic god that's in your head. That is not only is the only god you worship, it's the one that is you. That's like a whole privileged position. And it's a very useful position to have. It's a very useful for people to think of themselves as one entity because it's useful coordination and stuff like this. But it isn't quite true.
Yeah.
And this is,
I think acknowledgement of this view does help you become more charitable and compassionate. And it sort of diffuses the boundaries between good and evil, because then these things are also diffuse if people are much more porous than they would imagine themselves to be. Then
they're very porous. And the thing I also want to think that I think is important, an interpretation of this that I don't like is that people are like, wow, I'm like everything, dude, and the whole universe is one, and therefore everything is love. And I'm like, no, you went too far, go back. Like, no, hold on. Like, some things are less you than other things. Some things are more you. This is what is called continuous agency. And like, for example, I might say some words to you that convince you to go do something. You go grab me a glass of water or something. Are you part of my body? Like, not like we wouldn't say that, but technically my brain outputs some neuron signals which caused a chain of events that caused a glass of water to come to my hand. So in a sense, I could think of you as part of my body, but it doesn't really make sense, right? Like, that's not how we would use those words. So you're like less me, but there is a causality there. Like, there is a causality between like, and this becomes especially important, for example, with corporations. So corporations, when well constructed to a large degree, can be thought of extended bodies, extended body minds of you, especially for like startups, for like smaller groups of people where you have like a strong founding figure or a small group of strong founders with a lot of support. You can think of it as a entity that is acting in a coordinated way. This is how people often treat CEOs implicitly. Like when they say, Sam Altman, did this in the name of OpenAI. But like, did he? Or was it this massive process of dozens of engineers and support staff and personal assistants and operations and all these things that through a long convoluted chain resulted in this thing happening? Where Sam was involved in this chain, of course. Of course he does. But can you say, oh, he did this? It's a spectrum. And I think this is a useful way to think about causality. And it's also a good way to think about blame and credit. Is there's very tempting to say, like, the guy who pulled the trigger, he gets all the blame or whatever. But is this actually a good way to think about how things work? Like, we have an intuition that, like, no, we should probably get the guy in charge and we should put him into prison. But even then, does that make any sense? So like recently I've been playing this video game called Cyberpunk 2077. It's a really nice video game. I like it a lot. And it's a cyberpunk world. So it's like dystopia, like corporations control the world, blah, blah, blah. And as part of the plot, one of the characters is like, these evil corporate guys, we have to like find the CEO and we're going to have to like kill him. We have to defeat him, whatever, right? And me as a player, I'm just like, no, that doesn't help. Even if you find the CEO of the evil megacorp, and even if you kill him, it doesn't matter. He just gets replaced the next day. Like, what's the point? The board will just elect a new CEO who's just as evil. Like killing the CEO doesn't help. And so this is like this kind of interpretation of this kind of things. Like, it's not use, like, a thing that's happened to me multiple times is a well-meaning journalist will come to me and ask me a question like, is Sam Altman nice? Is he a good guy? Like, does he care about safety? Or is Demis, is he a good guy or a bad guy or whatever? And my answer to this question is, it shouldn't matter. It shouldn't depend on whether some tech CEO is a nice guy or a bad guy, that whether or not the future will go well. This is a bad system. Like, we should just not have a system which allows this to be the case. So I don't care if Sam Altman's a nice guy or a bad guy. I don't care if Demis is a nice guy or bad guy. I've met both of them. A lot of positive things to say about them. Some negative things, but also a lot of positive, whatever. But ultimately, I don't care. There should be no one who makes these decisions. The causality of whether AGI gets created, of how the future goes, shouldn't depend, like, there should be no dependency node on this tech guy is a nice guy. Yeah. And so this is where I think this thinking is very important, is I think Roon is completely correct. AGI is being built by gods. It is not being built by people. And this is really important to understand. The entities that are building AGI, that are ruling the world, that are making these decisions, are not people. They don't follow people rules. They're gods. But that doesn't mean they don't follow rules. Gods are part of nature. They're mechanical. They can be understood. They can be modified. They can be fought. They can be hunted. This is all possible. But if you approach them as if they were people, if you use the methods you use on individuals, on gods, you will completely fail. Like, for example, a common strategy is appeasement. A lot of times, people, good-hearted people, will join a company that they don't agree with because they want to, change it from the inside. They want to get on its good side. So when it matters, they can put in a good word and steer it in a good direction. So this does work with people, except sociopaths. But like, gaining the loyalty of a person, ingratiating yourself with them, so that in a moment of crisis, they come to you for aid or for advice, that is a viable strategy for people. It is not a viable strategy for gods. This is not how gods work. And you will consistently be disappointed over and over and over again if you naively approach gods as if they were people. They're not. You have to use completely different methods in order to hunt.
Have you found ways to communicate or reason with gods? Like, I know this is the biggest problem, but how do you do so?
Many ways. I mean, we have a very complicated one called the legal system. That's a whole protocol for the God language. That's like
a god in itself, in some sense.
Of course. Well, it's implemented by various gods and has various godlike properties. But like our legal system is one of the most fascinating attempts at codifying and like writing down actual God code and God language and God structure and God and spells, like how to affect gods. Like it's so retarded, right? I signed some piece of paper in Delaware and now there's a new God.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's true, but it works, and people believe you. I could just like sign a piece of paper in Delaware, and they'd be like, okay, I am now X Inc., and people just believe me. They're like, yeah, you're X Inc. Cool, you're a company. Good job, nice. Like it works. You just cast the magic spell, you sign the stupid piece of paper, and if you don't do it, it doesn't work. If you don't sign the stupid piece of paper in Delaware, well, people don't care. Then you're not really a corporation. Like you're just like some guy pretending to be a corporation. But if you sign the piece of paper in Delaware, well, that counts. So the legal system and government and so on is a fascinating attempt to control gods, to shape gods. This is what regulation to a large degree is about. A large amount of regulation is not about controlling people. It's about controlling gods. It's about controlling how gods are allowed to interact. Also, how they're allowed to interact with people, how they're allowed to interact with each other. Legal personhood. Like we literally give gods personhood in the legal context. And this is actually good. This is actually based. This is actually a good way. I think this is good. And like we should be reasoning on this level. So yeah, you can interface with gods through the legal system, for example. You can interface with them through the spiritual, social, marketing realm. You can interface with them through narrative. You can interface with them through the commercial realm, obviously. Like that's what most gods are doing is commerce. Most of them are trying to make money in various ways. That's what most of them do. And so most gods are very receptive to money. And if you have a lot of money, you can make gods pay attention to you and do a lot of things you want them to do, and vice versa. So gods are not a magic, weird, out there thing. It's daily life. It's a question of how do you interact with the bureaucracy? How do you interact with a nation? How do you interact with a company? Is the same question as how do I interact with a god? And the answer is it's not that weird. Like we do this every day. We constantly interact with various gods. And sometimes it's really frustrating because a lot of gods are not super aligned with our, human worlds. So now the more interesting question is, all right, cool. We have some basic interaction protocols or whatever, but this is obviously insufficient. What's the advanced stuff? How do you hunt gods? How do you build new gods? Now, this is the interesting stuff. And you will see when we map this into normal language, it is mapped into how do you build a company? How do you win a political campaign? How do you create viral marketing? These are the same questions as how do you do advanced things with gods? How do you build gods? How do you control gods? How do you shape gods? How do you kill gods? All of these things are fundamentally the question of how do you get large groups of people to do or believe something in various ways. And there's many ways to do that, from marketing and campaigning, politics, and to money, building good products, narratives, fiction. There are many ways.
Got it. So Connor, since we are at the end of the time, I want to talk about Conjecture AI. You mentioned somewhere you want to blaze a path through on the underworld to build infrastructure. Is that what you're doing? Are you trying to build infrastructure? Tell me more about it.
Unfortunately, that is more of a side gig at the moment. I have, unfortunately, many things I need to do. So Conjecture itself is more focused. It is a company. It is a R&D company. We are working on developing AI systems that are useful, commercially viable, so we can get the benefits of AI while being controllable and understandable. And in particular, that we can know what they know and what they don't know. And they don't accidentally become more powerful. One of the things that most worries me about the current path of AI is that we have no idea how smart our AI systems are. We have no idea what GPT-4 can actually do in the limit. We don't know what Claude 3 can do. There was that funny post where someone was like, wow, look, Claude seems to have noticed it's in a test. Isn't that funny? Didn't expect that. So the problem isn't that result. Like, okay, whatever. The problem is the not predicted. If they were like, hey, we trained our system such that we predict it will be able to know this, and then it did. I'm like, okay, fair enough. That's all right. But no, it's complete black magic. It's complete dark arts. No one knows what's going on inside these things. And this is a big problem. So even if we wanted to prevent superintelligence from coming into existence, we currently can't because it'll happen accidentally. So forget all the people who want to do this on purpose. Even the people who don't want to do it on purpose currently cannot prevent it from happening accidentally. There is some number n such that GPT n becomes super intelligent. And we don't know what that n is. Maybe it's 5, maybe it's 6, maybe it's 7. Who knows? I don't think it's 8, but we don't know, right? It could be 5, it could be 4 for all we know, and we just didn't notice. I don't know. So we're building systems and developing novel, beyond state-of-the-art methods that allow us to have much more control over what AI systems actually learn and what they can actually do and not do. Still R&D phase there, and the separate thing of like blazing infrastructure through the underworld is kind of the thing I alluded to a bit earlier about bootstrapping. Currently a bit of a side gig, but unfortunately, like when I talk about the AI problem, it's tempting to only talk about the technical problem. But the true question of how do we build a good future for everybody is not a technical problem. It's also a technical problem. Well, not only a technical problem. It's a technical problem. It's a social problem. It's a political problem. And to some degree, it's a spiritual problem. And I think all these problems need to be solved. I'm willingly or not working on all of them kind of in parallel. I hope there will be more people who join me and others to try to solve these problems and work on these extremely hard problems, because I think we need to solve every single one. If we skip even one of them, then the future is going to be that great. But it is possible.
Yeah. On that note, thank you so much. I think it's wonderful to have people like you think about these problems and then sort of go into great depths to tease apart all the nuances. I'm sure a lot of people will find this wonderful, and I'll keep an eye on hopefully a lot of contributions from your side that prevent us from very obvious risks that are just out on the horizon. So thank you, Connor, for your time. It was wonderful chatting with you.
Thanks so much.